Chapter 38, England and Bonaparte, 1802–1815, by Charles Oman. When the Treaty of Amiens had been signed, the English people firmly believed that the Great War was ended, that the period of stress and anxiety, of heavy taxation and huge armaments, of threatened invasions and domestic strife, was finally closed. Bonaparte, who needed an interval of peace for the working out of his domestic policy, had affected a frank, liberal, and conciliatory spirit in dealing with our diplomatists, and had produced on them the impression that a reasonable as well as strong man was now at the helm at Paris. The France with which we had come to terms was no longer the wild and militant republic of the old Jacobin days, but a well-ordered and strongly centralized monarchy, though its ruler did not yet bear the title of king. If Bonaparte had really intended to accept the situation and dwell in peace beside us as a loyal neighbor, the Treaty of Amiens would have needed no defense. But Addington and his fellows had not gauged the first consul's true character or the peculiarities of his position. He had risen to power by war. His power depended on his military prestige, and a permanent peace would have ruined his control over his army, which he had gorged with plunder and glory, and turned into a greedy and arrogant military caste. But it was hard to expect English statesmen to see through the character and designs of a man whom the French themselves had not yet learnt to know. And when an honorable peace was proffered, it would have been wrong to refuse it. The internal condition of England called for rest and retrenchment. But the first consul's real objects in concluding the Peace of Amiens were purely personal and selfish. He wished to recover PG 599, the lost French colonies, and to rebuild the ruined French navy. He needed peace to reorganize the control of France over her vassal states in Holland, Italy, and Switzerland, which she had bound to her chariot wheels during the late wars. Most of all, he required a space of leisure to prepare for that assumption of monarchical power, which he had been plotting ever since his return from Egypt. While England was thinking only of peace, and while thousands of English were embarking on the continental travel which had been denied them for 9 years, Bonaparte was already beginning to show the cloven hoof. In the autumn of 1802, he annexed to France the continental half of the dominions of our old ally the King of Sardinia and the Duchy of Parma. He sent 30,000 men into Switzerland to occupy the chief passes of the Alps. He ordered the vassal republics in Holland and North Italy to place prohibitive duties on English merchandise. These actions, though irritating, were not actual breaches of the peace, but things grew more serious when he made the impudent request that we should expel from our shores the exiled princes of the old royal house of France, and that our government should suppress certain newspapers which criticized his rule in France too sharply. These demands were of course refused. The first consul then began to harp on the question of the evacuation of Malta. That island was still garrisoned by English troops, as its old masters, the Knights of St. John, were not yet in a position to resume their dominion there. When England refused to evacuate Malta at once, and ventured to remonstrate about the annexation of Piedmont and Parma, Bonaparte assumed a most offensive attitude. He summoned Lord Whitworth, our ambassador at Paris, into his presence, and in the midst of a large assembly at the Tuileries delivered an angry harangue to him, declaring that the English cabinet had no respect for honor or treaties, and was wishing to drive him to a new war. He did not wish to fight, he said, but if he once drew the sword, it should never be sheathed till England was crushed. This insulting message roused even the feeble Addington to anger. With extreme reluctance and dismay, the cabinet began to contemplate the possibility of a renewed war with France. PG 600, a royal message was laid before Parliament asking for increased votes for the army and navy, which had just been cut down on account of the peace. Bonaparte, on the other hand, began to move masses of troops towards the shores of the English Channel, and to order the building of many ships of war. Addington attempted further negotiations for staving off a collision, but met no response from the first consul, who refused to listen to any offers till we should have evacuated Malta, and recognized the legality of his annexations in Italy and Switzerland. Nothing could be done to bring him to reason, and on May 12, 1803, our ambassador left Paris, and war was declared, only 13 months after the signing of the Peace of Amiens. Bonaparte had perhaps been intent on bullying the English cabinet and had fancied that they would yield to his hectoring. He showed intense irritation when war was declared, and committed a flagrant breach of international law by seizing all the English tourists and travelers who were passing through France on business or pleasure, and imprisoning them as if they were prisoners of war. They were about 10,000 in number, and Bonaparte had the cruelty to keep them confined during the whole of the war. Another sign of his malice was that he kept accusing the English government of instigating assassins to murder him. There was, indeed, hardly a crime which he did not lay to the account of his enemies. The second act of the great drama of the French War had now begun. The first had lasted 9 years. This was to endure for 11, from May 1803 to March 1814. The whole war is indeed one, if we regard it as the last struggle for commercial and maritime supremacy between England and her old rival, and compare it with the 7 Years' War and the War of American Independence. But on the other hand, the aspect of the strife was greatly changed by the fact that England had no longer the principles of the Revolution to fight, but was engaged in a struggle against an ambitious despot, a world conqueror who had no parallel save Caesar or Alexander the Great. The France of Bonaparte only resembled the France of Robespierre in the unscrupulous vigor of her assaults on her enemies. She was no longer professing to fight PG 601 for a principle, the deliverance of oppressed peoples from the yoke of monarchy, and the proclamation of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all men. Though Bonaparte still made a parade of being a beneficent liberator, yet France was now fighting to make herself the tyrant state of Europe, to win power and plunder, not to carry out the principles of the Revolution. In the long struggles that followed the declaration of war in 1803, Bonaparte at one time and another struck down every government in Europe that dared to stand against him. But England he could never subdue. From the moment when Sidney Smith turned him back from the walls of Acre, down to the moment when Wellington drove him a broken and defeated adventurer from the hillside of Waterloo, it was always England that stood between him and complete success. Hence it came that he honored her with a venomous hatred such as he never bestowed on any other foe. It may be said with much truth that his whole career after 1803 was a crusade against England, and that all his actions were directed to secure her ruin, whether that ruin was to be brought about in the open strife of contending fleets, or in the slow but deadly working of laws aimed against English commerce and industries. When Bonaparte was meeting and beating the Austrian, the Prussian, or the Russian, he felt that he was fighting the hired soldiers of England, for every confederacy against him was cemented with English gold. The final object of all his continental wars was to crush us. His victories were all means to that end. In a contest between a single despot and a free state, the former has in many ways the advantage. He has no parliament to criticize his actions, no public opinion before which he is bound to justify his every deed. He can work out his schemes in his own brain and give them the unity that a single mastermind inspires. He can secure the implicit obedience of his lieutenants, because he alone can make or mar their career. On the other hand, the policy dictated by an English cabinet of a dozen men was prone to lack consistency and singleness of aim, and their plans and projects were divulged to Parliament, criticized by opponents, and trumpeted out to all Europe by the press, before they were well set in hand. It was no light responsibility that the Addington ministry took upon themselves when they declared war on the unscrupulous First Consul. The long struggle which followed may be divided into 4 epochs. In the first, 1803–1805, Bonaparte strove to settle the national duel by an actual invasion of England, and lamentably failed. In the second, 1805–1808, England fought by subsidizing foreign allies, while Bonaparte struck at his enemy by the continental system, a plan for starving English trade. In the third period, 1808–1814, a new aspect was given to the struggle by the interference of England on land. Instead of relying on subsidies, we poured troops into Spain and met the French face to face. At the same time, the intolerable oppression which Bonaparte exercised over all the states of the continent led to national risings against him, which finally, in 1814, wrought his downfall. The fourth period comprises only the 100 days of March-June 1815, in which the tyrant tried to seize once more his old place and power, and suffered his final defeat at Waterloo. In the first opening months of the war, Bonaparte set his mind on bringing the struggle to a rapid conclusion by crossing the Channel and invading England. He dispatched 0 veteran troops to the coast between Dunkirk and St. Valery and fixed his own headquarters at Boulogne, where the cliffs of Folkestone and Dover were actually in sight. "The channel is but a ditch," he said, "and anyone can cross it who has but the courage to try." A fog might enable his whole army to slip across unseen, or a fortunate gale might drive away the English fleet for the short 24 hours that he required. Hundreds and afterwards thousands of flat-bottomed boats were collected at Boulogne and the neighboring ports, and fitted up, some as armed gunboats, some as transports. The troops were trained to embark with extraordinary speed so that they might not lose a minute when the signal for sailing should be given. But from June 1803 to September 1805 they waited, and yet the signal was never given. England faced the trial with wonderful courage. The nation was so wrathful at the wanton renewal of the war by Bonaparte, and at his arrogant threat of invasion, that it made efforts such as had never been dreamed of before. While the Addington ministry were doubting how best to meet the projected attack, the PG 603 nation itself solved the problem by the great volunteer movement. Almost every able-bodied man in England and Scotland offered himself for service. By the autumn of 1803, there were 347,000 volunteers under arms, besides 120,000 regular troops and 0 militia. This was a marvelous effort for a kingdom which then only count 0 souls. The volunteers, it is true, were imperfectly trained, often insufficiently officered, and unprovided with a proper proportion of cavalry and artillery. But when we consider their numbers and enthusiasm, it is only fair to conclude that even if Bonaparte had thrown across his 120,000 or 150,000 men into Kent or Sussex, he would have been able to do little against such a vast superiority of numbers. Not contented with enrolling men for land service, the government displayed great energy in strengthening our first line of defense, the fleet. The dockyards were worked with such zeal and speed that 166 new vessels were added to the navy before the year was over. Blockading squadrons were hastily sent out to face all the French and Dutch naval ports, as they had done in the Old War. Not the least of the signs of national enthusiasm was that, in obedience to the public voice, Pitt, whose name was now bound up with a vigorous war policy, was recalled to the helm of state with the king's consent, while the weak Addington retired into the background. While Bonaparte was drilling his army for rapid embarkation and multiplying his gunboats, he utilized the time to stir up trouble for England in all parts of the world. He gave his approval to a wild scheme for an Irish rebellion, headed by the rash young revolutionary, Robert Emmet, whose only achievement was to cause a riot in Dublin, murder Lord Kilwarden, the Chief Justice of Ireland, and get himself promptly hung. A more dangerous blow was aimed at our empire in India. French military adventurers had been many and prosperous in the native courts of that country ever since the days of Dupleix, and the first consul hoped by their aid to stir up the Nizam and the Maratha powers against England. But he had to deal with the able and vigorous Lord Wellesley, the greatest governor-general that India has known since Warren Hastings. Wellesley forced PG 600 for the Nizam to dismiss his French officers, and allied himself with the Peshwa, the nominal head of the Maratha Confederacy, against the other chiefs of that nation. In 1803, Lord Lake conquered Delhi and the Doab from the French mercenaries of Sindhia, the most powerful of these rulers, while Arthur Wellesley, the Governor-General's brother, was fighting further to the south against Sindhia himself and the Raja of Berar. In the brilliant battles of Assaye and Argam, this young general beat the Maratha hosts, though they were 9-1 against him. The two hostile princes were forced to make peace and cede to the East India Company their outlying dominions, Sindhia's fortresses in the north, which became the nucleus of our northwestern provinces, and the Raja of Berar's province of Orissa, which was added to Bengal, 1804. In the winter of 1803-04, Bonaparte began to doubt the wisdom of attacking England with his flotilla of gunboats and transports only, and resolved to wait till he could concentrate in the straits a fleet of line-of-battle ships, capable of beating off the English Channel Squadron. While this plan was being worked out, he brought the internal affairs of France to a crisis. In the spring of 1804, an abortive royalist conspiracy against him was detected, and he took advantage of it to assume a higher and firmer position in the state than that of First Consul. Accordingly, his servile Senate requested him to accept the title of Emperor. In May 1804, he forced the Pope, who stood in mortal dread of annexation, to come up to Paris and preside at his coronation, a great and costly pageant, which marked the end of even the shadow of liberty in France. Bonaparte assumed the title of Napoleon I, thus making his own strange Christian name notable for the first time since history begins. When his coronation festivities were over, Napoleon set his mind seriously to the task of concentrating a great fleet in the Channel to cover the crossing of his army. In the autumn of 1804, the days of the old naval leagues against England in 1782 and were renewed, when the emperor forced Spain to join him, demanding either a money contribution or an auxiliary fleet. The feeble Charles IV chose to give the money, but the vessels which bore PG 605, the treasure, were seized by an English squadron, and Pitt promptly declared war on Spain. By utilizing the large Spanish fleet, Napoleon thought that he could gather together an armament strong enough to keep the Channel open for the crossing of the legions which lay at Boulogne. But meanwhile, English blockading vessels were already watching Cartagena, Cadiz, and Ferrol, as well as Toulon and Brest, and a hard task lay before the emperor, when he determined to concentrate the scattered naval forces of France and Spain. While Napoleon was busy with this scheme, Pitt had been returning to his old policy of finding continental allies for England and stirring them up against France. Austria and Russia had been greatly displeased by the same reckless annexations in 1803 which had driven England into war. But their grudges might not have grown into an anti-French coalition if it had not been for the energy of Pitt's diplomacy and the large subsidies which he offered. In the spring of 1805, things came to a head. On the one hand, the French emperor's scheme for the invasion of England was ready. On the other, Pitt's continental allies were secretly arming. Napoleon's plan was complicated but ingenious. Its strength lay in the fact that it was not easy for the English to judge what exactly would be his method, or to provide against it. He ordered the French Mediterranean fleet at Toulon to take advantage of the first rough weather, and to escape from its harbor whenever the English blockading squadron, now headed by the ever-active and vigilant Nelson, should be blown out to sea. Then his chief admiral, Villeneuve, was to slip past Gibraltar and to join the Spanish fleet at Cadiz, driving off the English ships which were watching that port. The united Franco-Spanish armament was then to sail right across the Atlantic to the West Indies, as if to attack our colonies there. But the real object of this demonstration was to entice Nelson, who was certain to chase them when he found their route far away from Europe. For when they had reached the West Indies, the Allied fleet were to turn sharply back again and steer across the Atlantic for Brest, where they would find another large French fleet, blockaded by Admiral Cornwallis and the English Channel Squadron. Villeneuve, as the emperor calculated, would be able to deliver PG 606, the Brest fleet, some weeks before Nelson could appear in Europe. He would then have 70 ships to oppose the 35 with which England guarded the Channel, and with such overwhelming superiority would be able to clear the Dover Straits and convoy across the army which had been waiting so long at Boulogne. In the first part of this great naval campaign, the emperor's elaborate scheme worked well. Villeneuve slipped out of Toulon, while Nelson's fleet was blown away by rough weather. He hurried away to Cadiz, liberated the Spaniards there, and was off to the West Indies before Nelson could find out what had become of him. Very tardily, the great English admiral discovered his route and hurried across the Atlantic in pursuit. In due pursuance of the scheme of Napoleon, Villeneuve turned back and steered for Brest, while his pursuer was seeking him off Barbados. But here the good fortune of the French ended, and a combination of chance and skill saved England. So slow was the Franco-Spanish fleet, and so bad at seamanship, that Nelson gained many days upon them. He luckily chanced upon a ship that had seen them turn back, hastily shifted his own course to follow, and sent to England to warn the Lords of the Admiralty that Villeneuve might be expected off Brest. With most commendable haste, a squadron under Admiral Calder was organized to encounter Villeneuve before he could reach Europe. It sailed out just in time to meet him as he got into the Bay of Biscay and fought him off Cape Finisterre. Villeneuve was not a man of nerve, and though Calder's squadron was far inferior to his own, he turned aside after an indecisive battle. So Napoleon heard in August 1805, to his disgust and wild anger, that the fleet which was to enable him to cross the Channel had not appeared off Brest, but had dropped into Ferrol to refit after the fight with Calder. Then, to make things yet worse, Villeneuve sailed from Ferrol not for Brest, but for Cadiz to strengthen himself yet further with Spanish reinforcements. This delay enabled the eager Nelson to arrive in European waters, and at the critical moment, he and Calder, with 28 ships, lay outside Cadiz, while the 35 Franco-Spanish vessels were within its harbor. The emperor's plan PG 607 was therefore wrecked, and no chance remained of the longed-for fleet sailing up the channel to meet the 150,000 men who sat idly waiting for it at Boulogne. Seeing his scheme shattered, while at the same time rumors of the Austro-Russian coalition had reached him, Napoleon dropped his long-cherished invasion scheme. He suddenly turned his back on the sea, and declaring war on his continental enemies before they were ready for him, came rushing across France toward Germany with incredible speed. But before he started, he sent his unfortunate admiral at Cadiz a bitter letter, in which he taunted him with cowardice for having turned away from Brest and ruined the plan for invading England. Stung to the heart by the imputation of want of courage, Villeneuve came out of Cadiz to fight Nelson, in order to show that he was not afraid, not in order to secure any useful end, for the time for that was over. Off Cape Trafalgar, 27 English ships met the 33 Allied vessels, and at the great battle of that name, completely destroyed Villeneuve's fleet. Nelson's splendid naval tactics easily compensated for the disparity of numbers. Seeing the enemy lying before him in a long line, he formed his own ships into 2 columns and swooped down on the center of the Franco-Spanish armada. He cut the enemy in 2 and destroyed their midmost ships ere the wings could come up. Of the 33 hostile vessels, 19 were taken and 1 burnt, but in the moment of success, the great admiral fell. He had led the attacking column in his own ship, the Victory, and pushing into the thickest of the enemy, was laid low by a musket ball ere the fight was half over. But he lived long enough to hear that the day was won, and died contented, October 21, 1805. In her grief for Nelson, England half forgot her joy at the most decisive naval triumph that we had ever gained, for Napoleon was driven to own himself impotent at sea, and the spirits of the French seamen were so broken that they never dared again to put out to sea, save in small numbers for secret and hurried cruises. For the future, the emperor determined to strike at English commerce by decrees and embargoes, not to attack England herself by armed force. But for the moment, to put down Austria and Russia was his task. Already, before Trafalgar had been fought, he had crushed the vanguard of the Austrians at Ulm, where the imbecile General Mack laid down his arms with nearly 40,000 men, while the Russians were still miles away, toiling up from Poland. Vienna fell into his hands before the Allies were able to join their forces. A month later, they met the French on the snow-covered hillside of Austerlitz, a village some 80 miles northeast of the Austrian capital. Here Napoleon beat them with awful slaughter. Left with only the wreck of an army, the Emperor Francis II asked for peace and got it on humiliating terms. He had to cede his Italian dominions, as well as the Tyrol, the very cradle of the Habsburg dynasty. Moreover, he gave up his old title of head of the Holy Roman Empire, the imperial style which had lasted since the days of Charlemagne, and had remained in the Austrian line for 350 years, and was constrained to take the new and humbler name of Emperor of Austria. The news of this disaster, to the coalition which had cost him so much trouble to knit together, and from which he had expected so much, broke Pitt's heart. He had been in ill health ever since he took office in 1804, the constant stress of responsibility, while the invasion was impending, having shattered his nerves. He died on January 23, 1806, aged no more than 46. He had been Prime Minister for nearly half this short span of life, and had certainly done more for England in his tenure of office than any man who has ever occupied that position. The death of Pitt, and the public dismay at the breakup of the coalition of 1805, led to a demand for a strong and united ministry that should combine all parties for the national defense. There was no man among the Tories great enough to take up Pitt's mantle, and Addington, the late Prime Minister, Lord Grenville and several other leaders of that party were ready to admit the long-exiled Whigs to a share in the administration. The king was discontented at having to receive his old foe, Charles James Fox, as a minister, but bowed to the force of public opinion. Thus came into being the short Fox-Grenville cabinet, which contemporary wits called the Ministry of All the Talents, on account of its broad and comprehensive character, for it included PG 609 all shades of opinion, from Addington at the one end to Fox at the other. Fox had always opposed war with France, and had maintained that if the late ministry had met Napoleon in an open and liberal spirit, they might have secured an honorable peace. But when he himself was given the opportunity of testing the Corsican's real temper, he met with a bitter disappointment. Napoleon was too angry with England to think of any accommodation. He offered Fox terms which were absolutely insulting, considering that England had held her own and successfully kept off invasion. Fox died soon after, worn out by the hard work of office, to which he had been a stranger for 20 years, September 1806. After his decease and the failure of the peace negotiations, the Grenville ministry had no great reason for existence. It was forced to continue the war policy of Pitt, but met with no success in several small expeditions that it sent out to vex the French and Spaniards. In March 1807, the ministers resigned, after a quarrel with the king on the same point which had wrecked Pitt in 1802, the question of Catholic emancipation. The only good work which this short administration had done in its 13 months of office was to abolish the slave trade. On the resignation of the Whigs, the Tories came back into power. Their nominal chief was now William Bentinck, Duke of Portland, an aged man, one of the Whigs who had been made Tories by the French Revolution. But the shrewd and ambitious Spencer Perceval, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, was the real leader of the Tories. He was a narrow-minded man of moderate ability, whose only merit was that he clung to the policy of Pitt and continued to hammer away at the French in spite of all checks and failures. After Austerlitz, Napoleon assumed the position of tyrant of all Central Europe. He created his younger brother Louis King of Holland and drove out the Spanish Bourbons from Naples in order to make his eldest brother Joseph king of the Two Sicilies. He formed the smaller German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, of which he declared himself protector. These high-handed doings were certain to provoke further fighting, for Russia, though defeated at Austerlitz, did not consider herself beaten, and the strong military state of Prussia was bound to resent the ascendancy of the French in Germany. Frederick William III, the rather irresolute monarch who swayed that country, had been half inclined to help Austria in 1805. But he delayed till the campaign of Austerlitz was over, and then found that he must fight Napoleon alone. Relying on the strength of his army and the old traditions of Frederick the Great, he declared war on France in 1806, hastily patching up treaties of alliance with Russia and England. Of all the disasters which befell the powers of the continent at Napoleon's hands, none was so sudden and crushing as that which Prussia suffered in 1806. Only a few weeks after the declaration of war, the Prussian monarchy was ruined. The emperor's swiftness and power of concentration were never shown more brilliantly. After defeating the Prussians at Jena, October 1806, he pursued them so furiously that he captured their whole army, more than 100,000 men, at Magdeburg, Lübeck, and Prenzlau. Nearly all the Prussian fortresses surrendered, and Frederick William escaped beyond the Vistula with only 12,000 men to join his Russian allies. After entering Berlin, Napoleon pushed on into Poland to meet the advancing forces of Tsar Alexander. In the bitter cold of a Polish February, he fought the Battle of Eylau with the Russians, and for the first time in his life, failed to gain a decisive victory over these stubborn foes. But in the following May, he finally settled the campaign by winning the bloody fight of Friedland, after which the Tsar asked for peace. At the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon dictated his terms to Russia and Prussia. Alexander was left comparatively unmolested. He was not stripped of territory, but only compelled to promise aid to Napoleon's schemes against England. But Prussia was absolutely crushed. Half her territory was taken from her, the eastern districts to form a new Polish state called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, the western to make, along with Hanover and Hesse, a new kingdom of Westphalia for Napoleon's youngest brother Jerome. In addition, all the Prussian fortresses received French PG 611 garrisons, and a fine of £26 million was imposed on the mutilated kingdom, June 1807. Since Trafalgar, the emperor had been pondering over new schemes for ruining England. In a leisure moment during the Prussian campaign, he devised the celebrated Berlin Decrees. The English, as he thought, mainly lived upon the revenues that they earned by being the middlemen between Europe and the distant lands of Asia and America. Their carrying trade was the staple of their prosperity, and if he could destroy it, England must go bankrupt. Accordingly, the Berlin Decrees declared a blockade against goods made or brought over by the English in every country that France could influence. Now the idea of a naval blockade is familiar enough, but Napoleon's scheme contemplated its exact converse. He had resolved to station soldiers and custom house officers round every mile of coast in Europe, to prevent English vessels from approaching the shore, and to see that not a pound's worth of English manufactures or colonial produce should be imported. The decrees declared the British Isles under blockade as regards the rest of Europe. No subject of France or of any vassal power was to trade with them. All Napoleon's unfortunate subject allies, Prussia, Holland, Spain, and the powers of Italy were forced to assent to this strange edict, and the Tsar of Russia was cajoled into accepting it. Napoleon thought that he had thereby struck a deadly blow at England, for every European state, save Sweden, Turkey, and Portugal, and the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, was at his beck and call. But he had not calculated on the greatness of the sacrifice which he was asking his allies to make. They were to give up, in order to please him, many of the comforts, even the necessities of life: West Indian sugar and coffee, the tea, pepper, and spices of the East, the cloth and linen of England, the muslin of Hindustan. The English government boldly accepted the emperor's challenge, and replied that if there was to be no English trade with the continent, there should not be any trade at all. By the orders in Council of November, 1807, the whole coastline of France and her allies was declared in a state of blockade, and the war vessels of England were directed to seize as prizes all ships entering them, PG 612, whether neutral or not, unless before sailing for the continent such vessels should have touched at an English port. Napoleon replied by the Milan Decrees, de 1807, which declared that any vessel belonging to a neutral power which had touched at any British port should be considered a lawful prize, and ordered all British merchandise found on the continent to be confiscated and burnt. Thus, between the Berlin Decrees and the orders in council, all the ports of Europe were formally closed. The one great neutral power, the United States of America, felt this blow bitterly and bore a deep grudge against both parties in the strife. From the very first, the result of the continental system, as the emperor's plan was named, was very different from what he had expected. The English manufactures and colonial wares, which he intended to exclude, contrived to creep, nevertheless, within the bounds of his empire. All along the coasts of Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, there sprang up an extraordinary development of smuggling. From Heligoland, the Channel Isles, Gibraltar, and Sicily, hundreds of vessels sailed by night to land their cargoes in secret. But if the merchandise arrived, it came by such hazardous and circuitous ways that its price was vastly increased. Napoleon did not succeed in ruining the commerce of England, but he succeeded in making Germans and Russians and Italians pay monstrous prices for their coffee or their sugar, and got their well-earned curses for it. Napoleon's restless energy in carrying out his scheme for the isolation and financial ruin of England led him into new troubles in another part of Europe, less than 3 months after he had ended his Polish campaign by the Peace of Tilsit. The little kingdom of Portugal was, with Turkey, almost the last state in Europe which had not accepted the continental system. Loth to lose their valuable commerce with England, the Portuguese tried evasion, and returned shifty answers when Napoleon bade their Prince Regent accept the Berlin Decrees. Without waiting for further provocation, the tyrant, who had now grown impatient of the slightest remonstrance against his fiat, declared that the House of Braganza had ceased to reign, and sent an army under General Junot across Spain to occupy Lisbon. The Prince Regent was forced PG 613 to fly by sea, and the French overran the whole of his kingdom. But from the first moment of his interference in the peninsula, it is probable that Napoleon had wider schemes than the mere conquest of Portugal. The crown of Spain was now worn by the imbecile and worthless old King Charles IV, who lived in constant strife with his cowardly and intriguing son and heir, the infant Ferdinand. There was nothing to choose between them in the way of incompetence and effeteness. In 1807, this wretched pair were at the height of their domestic quarrels, and each was trying to curry favor with Napoleon. They were always carrying complaints about each other to him and asking for his support. Then Napoleon, as if he were the recognized arbiter of kings, summoned the quarrelsome father and son to meet him at Bayonne on the French frontier, that he might settle their disputes. They came, each full of charges against his relative. But Napoleon, when he had them both safely under his hand, suddenly adopted a new tone, pronounced them both unfit to rule a great nation, and then declared that his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, whom he had made ruler of Naples 2 years before, would be the best king for Spain. Accordingly, he forced the two Bourbons, half by threats, half by cajolery, to abdicate, and sent them into the interior of France. A few Spanish nobles who had accompanied them to Bayonne were induced to accept Joseph, and then Napoleon pretended that his brother was legally constituted King of Spain. There were many French troops in the peninsula who had been sent there under the pretense that they were to help Junot in conquering Portugal. At the concerted signal, these regiments seized the neighboring Spanish fortresses and proclaimed Joseph king. After a rising of the populace of Madrid had been put down with much bloodshed by the French troops in the capital, it seemed as if Napoleon's piracy and kidnapping were to be crowned with success. June 15, 1808. This, however, was in reality far from being the case. As a matter of fact, he had now succeeded in involving himself in the most protracted and exhausting war in which he was ever engaged. He had roused by his treachery the most revengeful and fanatical people in Europe, PG 614, and had now to conquer a barren and arid country, where large armies starve and small armies get beaten. Spain sprang to arms on the news of the crime of Bayonne. The great towns everywhere proclaimed Ferdinand VII king, and though the central government was destroyed, juntas, or revolutionary committees, were formed in every province and began to raise troops to resist King Joseph. The news of the Spanish insurrection was received with joy in England, more especially because it was the first really national rising against the emperor that had yet been seen. Even the Whigs were enthusiastic for aiding Spain. "Hitherto," said Sheridan, "Bonaparte has contended with princes without dignity, numbers without ardor, and peoples without patriotism. He has yet to learn what it is to combat a nation animated by one spirit against him." Misled by their sympathy into overestimating the strength of Spain and the valor of her raw provincial levies, the English government, influenced mainly by Canning, a disciple of Pitt, who was now the most prominent among the younger Tory statesmen, determined to strike a bold blow by land against Napoleon. For the last 3 years, the very considerable body of regular troops in England, set free from the task of watching the Boulogne army, had been frittered away on small expeditions against outlying parts of the French and Spanish dominions, and had suffered nothing but checks. Now the cabinet determined to send a really formidable army to the peninsula. It was resolved to throw 20,000 men ashore in Portugal to assail Junot, who was cut off from the rest of the French armies by the revolt in Spain. To the Spaniards were sent subsidies of arms and money, but no troops. Bonaparte's notion that Spain could be annexed by a proclamation and held down by 80,000 men was destined to receive a rude shock. Almost simultaneously, 2 disasters fell upon his armies. A corps had been sent southwards to conquer Andalusia, where the insurrection was at its strongest. Its leader, General Dupont, allowed himself to be surrounded by superior numbers of Spanish levies at Bayonne, and after some grossly mismanaged fighting, laid down his arms with his whole force of 15,000 men, July 20, 1808. Junot, in Portugal, suffered almost the same fate. The English PG 615 began to land in Portugal a few days after the capitulation of Bayonne. When their leading divisions were ashore, headed by Sir Arthur Wellesley, the victor of Assaye and Argom, Junot marched against them to drive them into the sea. Finding Wellesley on the hillside of Vimiro, he attacked him recklessly. Aug. 21, for the French had not yet learnt to appreciate the worth of the British infantry. He received a crushing defeat, and his army would have been destroyed if Wellesley had been allowed to pursue him. But on the night of the battle, more troops arrived from England, and with them Sir Hugh Dalrymple, who was in command of the whole expedition. The cautious veteran refused Wellesley permission to follow up the flying enemy, and Junot escaped to Lisbon. But the Frenchman had been so badly beaten that by an agreement called the Convention of Sintra, he gave up Lisbon and all Portugal in return for being granted a safe passage back to France. English public opinion was disappointed that Junot's whole army had not been captured, and Dalrymple and Wellesley were put on trial for not taking Lisbon by force. The former, the responsible person, was deprived of his command. The latter was acquitted and sent back to Portugal to repeat his triumph of Vimiro on larger fields of battle. Meanwhile, while he was being tried in England, Sir John Moore, an able and experienced general, received the command of the English army in the peninsula. The news of Bayonne and Vimiro had roused Napoleon to fury, which grew still greater when he heard that his brother Joseph had evacuated Madrid and fallen back behind the Ebro. He determined to march in person against Spain with the Grande Armée. nearly 250,000 veterans, the victors of Austerlitz and Jena. Proclaiming that he was about to carry his victorious eagles to the Pillars of Hercules and drive the British leopard into the sea, he hurried over the Pyrenees and fell upon the raw Spanish levies who had now advanced to the line of the Ebro. With a few crushing blows, he scattered them to right and left and entered Madrid, 1808. All northern and central Spain were overrun, and Napoleon might have accomplished his boast and advanced to Cadiz and Lisbon, but for the daring diversion made by Sir John Moore and his 25,000 English PG 616. When that able officer heard that the emperor had passed southward and taken Madrid, he fell upon his line of communication and threatened to cut off his connection with France. He knew that this act would bring overwhelming numbers against him, but he also knew that it would save southern Spain for a space. When Napoleon learnt that Moore was in his rear, he hurriedly left Madrid and direct 0 men to chase the much-daring general. But Moore, satisfied to have drawn off the French, continually retreated before them in the most skillful manner, always offering battle to the French van, and retreating when their main body appeared. He thus drew Napoleon up into the extreme northwestern corner of Spain, among the rugged hills of Galicia. While engaged in this pursuit, the emperor received unwelcome news which drew him hastily back to Paris. The English government had not been idle during the autumn of 1808, and had formed a new coalition with Austria, who in 3 years had begun to recover the disaster of Austerlitz, and to chafe against Napoleon's dictatorial ways and the inconveniences of the continental system. Seeing the emperor entangled in the Spanish War, Austria thought the opportunity of attacking him too good to be missed, and was preparing to send her armies into South Germany while Napoleon was chasing Moore into Galicia. The emperor was forced to leave the greater part of his army in Spain and to hurry off to the Danube with his guards and picked troops. Marshal Soult, whom he sent in pursuit of Moore, followed him as far as the sea, where an English fleet was waiting at Corunna to pick up the wayworn and jaded troops. To secure a safe embarkation, Moore turned sharply on the head of Soult's army and drove it back at the Battle of Corunna, Jan. 16, 1809. He fell in the moment of victory, but his efforts had not been in vain. His troops sailed away in safety, and the French invasion of Spain had been checked for 4 months by his bold stroke. The English cabinet had resolved not to abandon Spain and Portugal. When Moore's regiments returned to England, many of them were sent back to Lisbon and placed under Wellesley, the victor of Vimeiro, whose trial had ended in a triumphant acquittal. In April 1809 began that wonderful series of campaigns which was to last till March 1814, and to bear the PG 617 English standard in triumph from the Tagus to the Garonne. Fettered by timid instructions from the home government, linked to rash and jealous allies, and starting with no more than 20,000 British troops, Wellesley was bidden to hold his own in the peninsula, where more than 200,000 French troops were still encamped. He showed the rarest combination of prudence and daring, and brought his almost impossible task to a successful end, in spite of the tiresome stupidity of his Spanish confederates, and the inefficient support which the home government gave him. At any moment, during the first 3 years of his command, a single defeat would have caused the cabinet to recall him and withdraw his army from the peninsula, but the defeat never came, and Wellesley at last won the confidence he merited and was given adequate means to carry out his mighty schemes. The story of the war is the best proof of his abilities. A calm, stern, silent man, with an aquiline nose, clear gray eyes, and a slight, erect figure, he inspired implicit confidence, if his taciturnity and hatred of display or emotion PG 618 prevented him from winning the love and enthusiasm of his troops as many lesser generals have done. The sight of his long nose among us on a battle morning, wrote one of his veterans, was worth 10,000 men of reinforcements any day. While Napoleon was engaged in his Austrian War of 1809, Wellesley easily held his own in the peninsula. He defeated Marshal Soult at Oporto and drove him out of Portugal with the loss of all his artillery and baggage. Then, turning southward, he marched against Madrid in the company of the Spanish general Cuesta. But he found his allies almost useless. Cuesta was perverse and imbecile to an incredible degree, and his wretched provincial levies fled at the mere sound of the cannon, unless they were ensconced behind walls and trenches. At Talavera the Allied armies beat Marshal Victor and King Joseph, but all the fighting fell on the English. Cuesta's troops, sheltered in the town of Talavera, refused to come out of their defenses and left Wellesley's 20,000 men to repel the assaults of 40,000 French. After this experience of Spanish cooperation, the victor vowed that he would never again share a campaign with a Spanish army. July 28, 1809. The news of Talavera brought the French armies from all sides to aid the defeated Marshal, and beset by 100,000 men, Wellesley was obliged to retreat on Portugal. He got back in perfect safety, but his imbecile colleague Cuesta was caught and crushed by the pursuers. The result of the fighting at Talavera had given the English troops confidence, and the king conferred on the victor the title of Viscount Wellington. He would have preferred to receive reinforcements rather than honorary distinctions, but the cabinet had decreed otherwise. They had sent all the available troops in England, some 40,000 men, on an ill-judged expedition against Antwerp, which was too strongly fortified and lay too far inland to be readily taken by an army of such a size. The general placed in command was Lord Chatham, Pitt's elder brother, a dilatory commander who moved slowly and allowed himself to be detained in the siege of the minor fortresses, which guarded the way to Antwerp. The army landed on the swampy Isle of Walcheren and beleaguered Flushing for 3 PG 619 weeks. But in the trenches, the troops were smitten with marsh fever and succumbed so rapidly that the expedition had to be given up, when 11,000 men were simultaneously in hospital. Flushing was destroyed, but the troops had to return to England and had exercised no influence whatever on the fate of the war, July to August, 1809. If sent to Wellesley, they would have enabled him to crush King Joseph and take Madrid. Meanwhile, the Austrian War had ended in the triumph of Napoleon at the Battle of Wagram, August, 1809, though the gallant efforts of the Archduke Charles and the insurrection of the patriots of the Tyrol and northern Germany had seemed at first to shake his power. The Emperor of Austria was forced to cede all his Illyrian coastline, that Napoleon might make his blockade of English goods the stricter, to surrender half his share of Poland, and to give, the bitterest drop in his cup, the hand of his daughter Maria Louisa to the conqueror. This unhallowed union was only made possible by the divorce of Josephine Beauharnais, the wife with whom Napoleon had lived for the last 14 years. October, 1809. Freed from the Austrian War, and with his Grande Armée once more unoccupied, Napoleon resolved to make an end of the Spanish insurrection. He gave 70,000 fresh troops to Massena, the ablest of his marshals, and bade him drive Wellington into the sea and conquer all Spain and Portugal. The English general had foreseen some such assault from the moment that he heard the news of the defeat of Austria. He spent the winter of 1809-1810 in constructing a triple series of fortifications across the peninsula on which Lisbon stands, the famous lines of Torres Vedras. When Massena advanced against Portugal, Wellington retired slowly before him, wasting the country and compelling all the people to take refuge in Lisbon. He turned at Busaco, September 29, 1810, to inflict a sharp check on the heads of Massena's columns, but finally withdrew into his formidable lines. The French were brought to a stand before the unexpected obstacle, for they had no knowledge that Wellington had so strengthened his place of refuge. The position, armed with 600 pieces of artillery and defended by 30,000 English, and the whole of the militia of Portugal, seemed too strong to be PG 620 meddled with. Massena lay in front of the lines for 4 months, sending in vain for reinforcements to Spain. But his colleague Soult, occupied in the conquest of Andalusia and the sieges of Cadiz and Badajoz, would not come to his aid. Massena's army suffered bitter privations in the wasted and depopulated country, and at last, in March 1811, he was fain to draw back and retreat from Portugal, after having lost more than 20,000 men by sword and famine. Wellington followed him, perpetually harassing his retreat, and took post again on the borders of Spain, from which he had been forced back 6 months before. The triumphant defense of the lines of Torres Vedras was the turning point of the whole Peninsular War. The French were never again able to invade Portugal, and Wellington, strongly reinforced from England after his success was known, was for the future able to undertake bolder strokes and no longer forced to keep to the defensive. The last offensive movements of the French were stopped by 2 bloody actions fought in May 1811, within a few days of each other. In the north, Massena attacked Wellington in order to try to save the beleaguered fortress of Almeida, but he was repulsed at Fuentes d'Onoro, May 5, and was shortly afterwards recalled in disgrace by his master. In the south, Marshal Soult marched to relieve Badajoz, which was being besieged by Lord Beresford, Wellington's second-in-command, aided by the Spanish General Blake. Beresford met the French at Albuera and almost lost the battle, partly by his own unskillful generalship, partly by the sudden flight of his Spanish auxiliaries. But the day was saved by the celebrated charge of the Fusilier Brigade, in which the 7th Anid Fusiliers, only 1,500 strong, stormed a precipitous hill held by 7,000 French, and forced Soult to retreat. This was the bloodiest fight which an English army ever gained. Beresford lost 4,300 men out of 7,500, yet his indomitable troops won the day for him, May 16. The years 1810–1811 were the last years of Napoleon's ascendancy in Europe. They are marked by his final attempt to make the continental system effective, by the annexation of almost the whole coastline of Central Europe. He had already taken Rome and central Italy from the Pope in 1809. Now he expelled his own brother PG 622 Louis from Holland and appropriated that country. He next added to his dominions the whole north coast of Germany as far as the Baltic, including the Hanseatic towns and the realms of 4 or 5 of his vassals, the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine. These wild and arbitrary seizures, which made the coast of France extend from Rome to Lubeck, were to Napoleon mere episodes in the struggle with England. The Dutch and Germans would not enforce the blockade against English goods as stringently as he wished, and so he annexed them to make their secret trade with England impossible. The continental system was now in full swing. It was working in all Napoleon's own dominions, in France, Italy, and Illyria, in the lands of all his vassals, the German states, Poland, Denmark, Naples, Prussia, in Sweden, where one of his marshals, Bernadotte, had lately been made heir to the throne, and even in the territories of his reluctant allies, the emperors of Austria and Russia. Yet, in spite of Napoleon's many assertions to the contrary, England was neither ruined nor likely to sue for peace. There had of late been many changes in the persons who ruled England, but the policy of Pitt was still maintained by his successors. The old king, George III, had gone mad in 1810, and the nominal control of the country was now in the hands of his worthless, vicious son George, Prince of Wales, the old ally of the Whigs. But the regency was given him guarded with so many checks and limitations that he was completely in the hands of the ministry and could not do much harm. First Perceval, and after he had been shot by a lunatic in 1812, Robert Jenkinson, Earl of Liverpool, swayed the policy of England as Prime Minister. Both were men of moderate abilities and narrow minds, but they had the saving virtue of obstinacy, and stuck to the old policy of war with France through thick and thin. Their task was no easy one. Debt was accumulating in appalling loads from the expenses of the war. The taxes were increased year by year. Trade was much hampered by the continental system. A series of bad harvests raised the cost of corn to famine price, and led to endless discontent and rioting both in town and country. Our allies were beaten one by one on the continent. There was no compensating gain save Wellington's successes in Spain, and the fact that we had now full control of the seas, and had PG 623 absorbed the colonial trade of the whole world. Yet the Tories hardened their hearts and hammered away at the Corsican ogre with untiring zeal. Nor can it be doubted for a moment that they were right. Napoleon had to be put down, or England must perish. All honor therefore to the men, narrow-minded and prejudiced though they were, who carried out the struggle to the bitter end. They were at last about to be rewarded for their perseverance. Towards the end of 1811, Napoleon became involved in a third struggle with Russia, more deadly than those of 1805 and 7. The cause of the quarrel was the inevitable continental system. Hitherto England had been the largest buyer of Russian goods, and Russia had been wont to get her luxuries and colonial wares from England. The enforced prohibition of trade with her best customer did Russia untold harm, and the Tsar Alexander found that every class of his subjects was groaning under the yoke of the Berlin decrees. Discontent was rife, and Alexander knew well enough that Russia is a despotism tempered by assassination, and remembered the fate of his own father. He saw at last that his empire was losing more from alliance with Napoleon than she could lose by open war against him. Finally, the Russian government began to provoke the emperor by an almost overt neglect of his wishes, and practically abandoned the continental system. Napoleon was at the height of his arrogance and autocratic insolence. Instead of making an end to the war in Spain, the running sore, as he called it, from the drain which it caused on his resources, he resolved to impose his will on Russia by force and declared war upon the Tsar. A vast army of 600,000 men was concentrated in eastern Germany and crossed the Niemen in June 1812. But the Russians had taken example by the policy by which Wellington had foiled Massena in 1810. Instead of fighting on their frontier, they withdrew into the heart of their vast plains, wasting the country behind them and leaving no food for the invader. The French army had lost half its horses and a third of its men before it approached Moscow or fought a serious engagement. The Russians turned to bay at Borodino, in front of their ancient capital, but Napoleon stormed their PG 624 entrenchments at the cost of 25,000 men and entered Moscow. But he found it deserted by its inhabitants, and a few days after his arrival the whole city was burnt, whether by the deliberate resolve of the Russians or by the carelessness of the French soldiery. Winter was now at hand, and for want of food and shelter the emperor resolved to retire on Poland. But the season was too late, and he was surprised on his way by the snow. His harassed and half-starved soldiers died by thousands on the roadside. The Russians cut off every straggler, and less than a tenth of the magnificent army that had crossed the Niemen struggled back to Germany, no Jan. 1813. The fortune of war had at last turned, and Napoleon's first disaster was soon to be followed by his fall. Prussia and all his other unwilling subjects in northern Germany took arms when the fate of the Grande Armée became known, and to meet them, the emperor had to call up his last reserves of men, and especially to draw on the large force in the Spanish peninsula. But he found that little help could come from Spain, for 1812 had been as fatal to his marshals in the south as to himself in the far north. Early in the year, Wellington had swooped down on Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz, the two fortresses in French hands which covered the Spanish frontier. He stormed each of them after a siege of a few days, making the desperate courage of his soldiery serve instead of a long bombardment, and paying for his rapid success by a heavy loss of men. Badajoz was actually escaladed with ladders, the breaches having proved inaccessible. The French marshals came hurrying up to save their strongholds, but found them already fallen into English hands. There followed the decisive Battle of Salamanca, in which Wellington defeated Marshal Marmont and crushed the main army of the enemy. This fight was a splendid exhibition of his skill. His able adversary had for a moment put his left wing in a hazardous position. Before half an hour had elapsed, Wellington had pounced upon the isolated divisions, routed them, and attacked and scattered the main body. Thus, as was happily said, he beat 40,000 men in 40 minutes. In consequence of this victory, Wellington was able to retake Madrid after it had been 4 years in hostile hands. To check his further success, the French marshals had PG 625 to evacuate all southern and central Spain and mass their forces against the victor. When they beset him with 100,000 men, he was forced to retreat towards the Portuguese frontier for a space. But the net result of the campaign had been to deliver Andalusia and most of Castile from the enemy, and more was to follow. Napoleon had to withdraw so many of his veterans from Spain to replace his losses in the Russian war that in the next spring, Wellington was no longer in his wonted inferiority of numbers. He used his opportunity with his usual skill and promptness. Attacking the French before they had concentrated from their scattered winter quarters, he chased them before him in disorder all across northern Spain. It was only at Vitoria, close under the Pyrenees, that they could collect in numbers strong enough to face him. But there he fell upon them, routed Marshal Jourdan, cut off his retreat on France, and drove him into the mountains with the loss of every single cannon and wagon that the French army possessed June 21, 1813. The autumn of the year was occupied in subduing Saint Sebastian and Pampeluna, the two fortresses that guarded the French frontier, and in repulsing, at the battles of the Pyrenees, two gallant attempts made by Marshal Soult to relieve the beleaguered fortresses. At last they fell, and Wellington prepared to invade France in the next spring. Meanwhile, Napoleon, with a horde of conscripts and the few veteran troops that he could collect, had been fighting hard in Germany. Against the Russians and Prussians he held his ground for some time, but when his own father-in-law, Francis of Austria, joined the enemy, he was overwhelmed by numbers. The 3 days' strife at Leipzig, which the Germans call the Battle of Nations, sealed his fate. It was only with the wrecks of an army that he escaped across the Rhine in the autumn of 1813. The Allies followed him without giving him a moment's respite, a wise strategy that they had learnt from his own earlier doings. The emperor made a desperate fight in France, but the odds were too many against him. After some ephemeral successes, he was defeated at Laon by one body of the Allies, and their main army slipped past him and took Paris, April, 1814. On the news of PG 626, the fall of the capital, the French marshals compelled Napoleon to abdicate and laid down their arms. The humbled despot vainly attempted to commit suicide, fearing death at the victor's hands. But they spared his life, gave him the little Tuscan island of Elba as an appanage, and bade the man who had been the ruler of all Europe to spend the rest of his life in governing a rock and zero Italian peasants. The crown of France was given, with questionable wisdom, to the representative of the Bourbons, the eldest surviving grandson of Louis Roman 15. This shrewd and selfish old invalid, who was known as the Count of Provence, now took the title of Louis Roman 18, and mounted his martyred brother's long-lost throne. While the Austrians, Russians, and Prussians had been conquering Napoleon and capturing Paris, Wellington had not been idle. He had invaded France from the south, taken the great city of Bordeaux, and beaten Marshal Soult at the Battle of Toulouse. When the news of Napoleon's abdication brought his brilliant campaign to a conclusion, April, 1814. All Europe now began to disarm, dreaming that the deadly struggles of the last 22 years were over at last. Diplomatists from all nations were summoned to meet at Vienna to rearrange the map of Europe and parcel out Napoleon's ill-gotten spoils. England alone was unable to disband her armies, for she had still got a war on hand. In 1812, Napoleon had succeeded in stirring up against us the United States of America. Their grievance was the Orders in Council, by which we had prohibited neutral ships from trading with France, in retaliation for the Emperor's Berlin decrees against our own commerce. After 5 years of bickering and recrimination, the Americans declared war on us, though they might with equally good logic have attacked Napoleon, whose conduct to them had been even more harsh and provoking than that of the Perceval cabinet. With all her attention concentrated on the peninsula in 1812-13, England had little attention to spare for this minor war, and Canada was left much undermanned. But the small garrison and the Canadian militia fought splendidly, and 3 separate attempts to overrun the colony were beaten back, and 2 American armies forced to capitulate. But while so successful on land, PG 627, the English were much vexed, and surprised to suffer several small defeats at sea in duels between single vessels. The few frigates which the United States owned were very fine vessels, heavily armed and well manned. On 3 successive occasions, an American frigate captured an English one of slightly inferior force in single combat, a feat which no French ship had ever been able to accomplish in the whole war. In course of time, the American vessels were hunted down and destroyed by our squadrons, but it was a great blow to English naval pride that the enemy had to be crushed by superiority of numbers, instead of being beaten in equal fight. But the fact was that individually the American ships were larger and carried heavier guns than our own, so that the first defeats were no matter of shame to our navy. When Napoleon had been crushed, England was able to turn serious attention to America and to send many of the old peninsular veterans over the Atlantic. But their arrival did not crush the enemy so easily as had been expected. One expedition under General Ross, landing in Maryland, beat the Americans at Bladensburg and burnt Washington, the capital of the United States, 1814. But 2 others failed. The imbecile Sir George Prevost invaded the state of New York, but turned back without having done any serious fighting. On the other hand, the overbold Sir Edward Pakenham, one of the bravest of Wellington's officers, was slain at New Orleans with 2,000 of his followers, because he endeavored to storm from the front impregnable earthworks held by a steady foe, January 8, 1815. The war, however, had ceased just before Pakenham fell. Napoleon having abdicated, and the English having withdrawn the orders in council, the causes of our strife with America had been removed, and the 2 powers had signed the Peace of Ghent on December 24, 1814. This agreement restored the old condition of affairs, each party surrendering its conquests and agreeing to let bygones be bygones. But the struggle had bred much ill blood, not to be forgotten for many a year. By the new year of 1815, when the Treaty of Ghent had been PG 628 signed, England was at peace with all men, and the Liverpool ministry began to take in hand the reduction of our army and navy, the restoration of finance, and the protection of English interests in the resettlement of Europe at the Congress at Vienna, which had met in the previous autumn. All the diplomatists of the great powers were hard at work settling the new boundaries of their states, when suddenly, the alarming news was heard that Napoleon had escaped from Elba and landed in France. The rule of the selfish old Louis XVIII, and the elderly companions who had returned with him from a 20 years' exile, had irritated and disgusted the French, and most of all the army. When therefore Napoleon landed in Provence with 700 men, and called on his countrymen to rise in behalf of liberty and expel the imbecile Bourbons, his appeal met with a success such as he himself had hardly hoped for. Not a shot was fired against him. Regiment after regiment went over to his side, and Louis XVIII had at last to fly from Paris and take refuge in Flanders, March 1815. Napoleon proclaimed himself emperor once more, but promised the French a liberal constitution in place of his old autocratic rule. He also made overtures to the Allied powers, saying that he was tired of war and would accept any honorable terms. But they knew his lying tongue of old, and wisely refused to listen to his smooth speeches. One after another, all the monarchs of Europe declared war on him. Napoleon's second tenure of power was only to last from March 13 till June 22, 1815, the 100 Days, as they are generally called. Forced to fight, he displayed his old energy, and resolved to strike at the Allies before they could concentrate their scattered forces from the remotest ends of Europe. He called his old veterans to arms, and hastily organized an army of 130,000 men for an immediate attack on the nearest foe. By waiting longer, he could have collected an army thrice as great. But on the other hand, his enemies would have been able to mass their whole force against him. The only troops ready to oppose him by June 1815 were two armies in Belgium, one of Prussians under the old Marshal Blucher, which lay about Namur, Liege and Charleroi, the other a combined force of British, Germans and Dutch under Wellington, now a duke, PG 629 stationed round Brussels and Ghent. The Prussians were 120,000 strong, and Wellington 0 English and 0 Hanoverians, Germans and Dutch. Napoleon was therefore bound to be outnumbered, but he thought that he could crush one army before the other came to its aid, if he could only strike hard and fast enough. His advance into Belgium was rapid and skillful. He made for the point where the English left touched the Prussian right, near Charleroi, and thrust himself between them. On June 16, he engaged and beat Blucher's Prussians at Ligny, while his lieutenant, Marshal Ney, held back at Quatre Bras the front divisions of Wellington's army as they came marching up to try to join the Prussians. The Prussians were severely beaten, but the indomitable old Blucher gathered together his defeated forces and marched north to rejoin the English, while Napoleon vainly dreamed that he was flying eastward towards Germany. Thus it came to pass that the emperor sent Marshal Grouchy and 0 men to pursue the Prussians on the wrong road, a mistake which allowed Blucher to execute an undisturbed retreat on Wavre, where he was again in touch with the Duke. Meanwhile, Napoleon on the 17th marched to join his lieutenant Ney, who had been forced back from Quatre Bras by the English and needed his aid. The emperor, believing that the Prussians were disposed of, thought he could now deal a crushing blow at Wellington's motley army, and was overjoyed when he found the Duke offering him battle on the hillside of Mont Saint-Jean, 12 miles north of Quatre Bras, in a good position which covered the road to Brussels. On this hillside was fought next day, June 18, 1815, the decisive battle which the English call Waterloo, from the name of the village where Wellington wrote his dispatch that same night. The armies were not very different in numbers. Napoleon's 72,000 French were opposed to 67,000 troops in the Allied army. But Wellington could only count on his 23,000 English and 0 Hanoverians and Brunswickers for good and zealous service. He was hindered rather than helped by the presence of 20,000 raw Dutch and Belgian conscripts, who had no heart in the war, and would as soon have fought for Napoleon. His army was stretched along the gentle slope which is crossed by the Brussels road, with the infantry in PG 630 the front line, and the cavalry partly in reserve, partly on the wings. In front of his position were the two farms of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, the former held by the English guards, the latter by a picked battalion of Hanoverians. Napoleon ranged his men on the opposite ridge, and launched them against the English in successive attacks. His first attempt to storm the farm of Hougoumont was manfully beaten back. He then sent 4 heavy columns against the English left, but they were utterly routed by the charge of Picton's infantry and Ponsonby's famous Union Brigade of Dragoons, the Royals, Scots Greys, and Enniskillens. His third effort was to break the English centre by the furious charges of 15,000 gallant horsemen, supported by a tremendous fire of artillery. But the English squares held fast, though assailed for 5 hours by constant onsets of cavalry, and pounded in the intervals by an overwhelming force of cannon. Most of the Dutch and Belgians and some of the Germans retired from the field, and many fled to Brussels. But the indomitable squares held their own, even after the farm of La Haye Sainte had been stormed, and a gap opened in the English centre. In the thick of the fighting, Napoleon was surprised to see new troops coming up on his PG 631 right. These were Blücher's Prussians, marching from Wavre to aid the English, according to a promise which the old marshal had made to the Duke on the previous day. To hold them back, Napoleon had to detach nearly all his reserves. But for a final stroke against Wellington, he sent out 5,000 men of the Old Guard to break through the long-tried English line. But this last effort was foiled by the steady fire of Maitland's English guards, and when the attacking columns were seen recoiling down the hillside and Wellington's last cavalry reserves came charging after them, the whole French army broke and fled. Never was a more complete rout seen. The defeated army disbanded itself. Napoleon could not rally a man and fled to Paris, where he abdicated for a second time. Wellington and Blücher rapidly followed him and entered Paris, July 6. The ex-emperor, fearing death at the hands of the infuriated Prussians, fled across France to Rochefort and surrendered himself to the English man-o'-war which blockaded that port. After much discussion, the ministers resolved to send him as a prisoner to the desolate island of St. Helena, where he lived for 6 years, spending his time in dictating mendacious accounts of his life and campaigns, and in petty quarrels with the governor of the island. Napoleon was now really disposed of, and the pacification of Europe was complete. The Congress of Vienna had completed its work, and all the territorial changes which it dictated were carried out at leisure. England's share of the plunder in Europe was the islands of Malta and Heligoland and the Ionian Isles. Beyond seas, she got the French Isle of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean and the valuable Dutch colony of the Cape of Good Hope. But her real gain was the fact that she had absorbed, during the course of the war, nearly the whole of the carrying trade of the world. 20 years of her ascendancy at sea had destroyed the mercantile marines of France, Holland, Spain, and Italy, and it was many years before those countries could recover from their losses. The naval and commercial supremacy which we enjoy today is the direct result of the Great Wars of 1793–1815. This being so, the changes on the continent were of comparatively little moment to us. France was confined within her PG 632 old boundaries of 1789. Russia took the greater part of Poland, Austria was given Lombardy and Venetia, Prussia annexed half Saxony and most of the small states along the Rhine. Belgium and Holland were joined in an unnatural union as the Kingdom of the Netherlands, while the old despots of central and southern Italy returned to their long-lost thrones. These boundaries were to last, with little alteration, for half a century. And this including Ireland, where only the Protestants could be trusted with arms. In 67 duels of single English frigates with French, Dutch, or Spanish vessels of the same rating, the adversary succumbed. In no single case was an English vessel taken by an enemy of equal force.